The specific sound of a brass key refusing to turn in a deadbolt is something you never forget, especially when it's the front door of the house you built with your own 2 hands. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Hi, humbafanted on the dot. I had just stepped out of a cab after a grueling flight back from Honolulu, my skin baked to a dark mahogany, my joints aching, but my spirit lighter than it had been in years. 2 months in Hawaii had been my retirement gift to myself. At 68 years old, after 35 years of grinding 30-hour weeks as a high-end residential architect, I had finally earned the right to breathe. I was standing on the cedar porch of my life's masterpiece, a hi-fi million lakefront sanctuary in South Lake Tahoe that I had designed down to the millimeter. The sunlight was reflecting off the floor-to-ceiling windows exactly the way I had calculated it would during the summer solstice. I was home. But as I jiggled the key again, feeling the unforgiving resistance of a brand-new tumbler, a cold knot formed in my stomach. I didn't know it yet, but that locked door was the dividing line between the life I thought I had and a nightmare I wouldn't have wished on my worst enemy. Before I could reach for my phone, the heavy oak door swung inward. Standing in the foyer wasn't the welcoming face of my 28-year-old daughter, Daniela. It was her husband, Curtis. He was 37, a self-proclaimed venture capital consultant whose actual job seemed to consist of losing other people's money and hiding behind buzzwords. But what made my architect's eye twitch wasn't just his aggressive, bouncer-like stance blocking the doorway. It was what he was wearing. He had on my custom silk monogrammed robe, a gift from my late wife casually tied around his waist, holding a mug of my expensive imported espresso. "You're early, old man," Curtis said. The phrase hit the air like a wet towel. A year ago, it might have been a playful jab. Today, it was a classification, obsolete inventory. "Good to see you too, Curtis." I kept my voice perfectly level. 3 decades of managing hysterical clients during multi-million-dollar builds had given me a poker face carved from granite. "Looks like you changed the locks. And my robe. Hawaii was beautiful, by the way. Thanks for asking." "Cut the sarcasm, Walter," he snapped, taking a sip of the espresso. "We weren't expecting you until Thursday, but since you're here, we need to talk about space optimization. We've made some structural changes to the living arrangements." Before I could ask what the hell he meant by space optimization, Daniela appeared behind him, my beautiful daughter. The girl whose college tuition I had paid in full, whose lavish wedding I had entirely funded, and who, just 12 months ago, had sat crying at my kitchen island begging me to let her and Curtis move in temporarily because his latest crypto startup had gone bankrupt. I had welcomed them with open arms. I had cleared out 2 guest rooms. I had played the supportive father, because that's what a father does. But the woman looking at me now was a complete stranger. She was wearing a designer dress that cost more than my first car, her arms crossed tight against her chest. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She looked past me, staring at the driveway, and that's when I noticed the second anomaly. My late wife's prize-winning heritage rose bushes, the ones I had painstakingly maintained for 5 years since her passing, were gone, torn straight out of the earth. In their place, a patch of fresh asphalt had been poured to widen the driveway, and sitting squarely on top of my wife's memory was a brand-new, matte black Porsche Chinchumwe Mot. "What happened to the roses, Danny?" I asked, my voice cracking just a fraction. "They were an inefficient use of curb space, Dad," Daniela said, her voice devoid of any human warmth. It sounded rehearsed, like she was reading from a corporate HR script. "Curtis needed a place to park his new company vehicle so it wouldn't get sap on it. Listen, we need to have a serious conversation about boundaries and generational wealth transfer." "Generational wealth transfer?" I repeated, setting my heavy suitcase down on the porch. "Danny, I'm 68. I'm standing on my own porch, locked out of the house I hold the deed to, and you're talking to me like a tax auditor. Let me inside." Curtis stepped forward, physically filling the doorframe. "That's the thing, Walt. You're not coming inside. Not to this house. Danny and I are in our wealth-building phase. We're young. We have massive potential, and frankly, this property is being entirely wasted on a retired guy who just walks around taking pictures of birds all day. We need to entertain investors. We need the primary suite. We need the square footage." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, waiting for my daughter to slap his arm and tell him to stop playing this sick joke. But Daniela just nodded slowly, her face hardening into a mask of pure entitlement. "We're not putting you on the street, Dad," Daniela chimed in, adopting that slow, condescending tone usually reserved for pacifying a toddler. "We've completely repurposed the outbuilding for you. It's a perfect solution for someone in your sunset phase." The outbuilding, she meant the barn. 15 years ago, I had built a bonchum square-foot wooden shed at the absolute edge of the property line to use as a noisy workshop for my table saws and sanders. It had a single bare bulb, raw plywood walls, no insulation, and no plumbing. It smelled permanently of damp earth, motor oil, and rat droppings. In the Tahoe winters, the temperature in that shed regularly dropped below freezing. "You want me to live in the tool shed," I said, the reality of the betrayal sinking its teeth into my chest. The pain was so sharp it actually stole my breath for a second. This was my blood. This was the child I had sat up with at Ba Home, when she had a fever of mochumlea bone, the girl whose height was still marked in pencil on the kitchen pantry doorframe. "It's a tiny home," Curtis corrected smoothly, leaning against the door jamb. "Very trendy right now. We put a camping cot in there for you. It's all a guy your age really needs. A bed, 4 walls, and some quiet." "And if I say no?" I asked quietly. "If I call a locksmith right now, drill out that deadbolt, and walk into my own kitchen?" What happened next shattered whatever illusion I had left about my family. Curtis didn't yell. He didn't get physically aggressive. Instead, a slow, predatory grin spread across his face, and he pulled a thick manila envelope from the pocket of my robe. "If you make this difficult, Walter, Daniela, and I are prepared to make a phone call to the state. We've been documenting your cognitive decline over the past few months. Leaving the stove on, forgetting conversations, wandering the property at odd hours." "That's a complete lie," I fired back, my fists clenching so hard my fingernails bit into my palms. "Is it?" Daniela asked, looking at me with dead eyes. "California has very strict elder care laws, Dad. If we tell Adult Protective Services that you're suffering from advanced dementia and acting aggressively, they'll put a temporary conservatorship in place by Friday. They'll lock you in a state-run memory care ward where the nurses smell like bleach, and you share a room with a guy who screams at the wall. Or, you can take your bags, walk quietly to the barn, and we won't have to do this the ugly way. It's your choice." They had it all planned out. The changed locks, the destroyed garden, the psychological trap. They were banking on my shock. They expected the old, tired widower to break down, to cry, to beg for his own bedroom back, or to fly into a rage that they could secretly record and use as proof of my supposed mental instability. But 35 years in architecture teaches you one fundamental truth about structures. You never tear down a load-bearing wall until you know exactly where the weight is going to fall. I looked at my daughter. I searched her face for a shred of the girl who used to call me her hero. There was nothing there but a terrifying, hollow greed. She had chosen this parasitic grifter over her own father, and she was willing to destroy me to get what she wanted. The grief hit me like a physical blow, a heavy, suffocating weight in my lungs. But right behind that grief came something else, something cold, precise, and razor-sharp. "Fine," I said softly, picking up my suitcase. Curtis blinked, clearly taken aback by how easily I folded. "Fine? Just like that? You want the house, Curtis. You want to host your investors in my dining room. Go ahead, I'll take the shed." Without waiting for a response, I turned my back on my hi-fi Numui Million home, walked down the steps, past the gleaming black Porsche parked on my dead wife's roses, and made the long trek across the massive back lawn. The shed was exactly as dismal as I remembered. The hinges screamed in protest as I forced the warped wooden door open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the distinct odor of mildew. Sitting in the center of the concrete floor was a rusted, military surplus canvas cot. No blankets, no pillows, just the cot and a single, fly-specked light bulb dangling from a frayed wire. Through the dirty, cracked window pane, I had a perfect view of the back of my house. I set my suitcase on the cot. Through the glass, I could see Curtis and Daniela in the kitchen. Curtis was popping the cork on a bottle of my vintage Dom Perignon, the one I had been saving for Daniela's 30th birthday. They clinked glasses, laughing, celebrating their flawless victory over the weak, pathetic old man. I watched them for a long time, the cold seeping through the soles of my shoes. Then, I unzipped my suitcase. I bypassed the folded Hawaiian shirts and the macadamia nuts. I reached beneath the fabric lining of the bag, feeling for the hidden compartment I had sewn into the backing before I ever left for Honolulu. I pulled out a heavy matte black Pelican case. Inside wasn't just my prized Leica telephoto camera. Resting neatly beside the lenses was a prepaid, untraceable burner phone and a thick, legally binding document bearing the gold seal of the state of California. I powered on the burner phone and dialed a number I had memorized 3 months ago. It rang twice before a gruff voice answered. Clark Investigations. Helen, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. My eyes locked on the silhouette of my son-in-law drinking my champagne. It's Walter. You were right. They made their move today. Did they lock you out? She asked. Worse. They put me in the shed and threatened me with a fraudulent conservatorship. They think they've won. They think I'm completely broken. I heard the scratch of a lighter, followed by a long exhale of smoke on the other end of the line. Confident idiots are the easiest targets, Walter. The financial traps are already set. Should I authorize the first phase? I looked down at the legal document in my hand, a document that proved I was 10 steps ahead of the bloodsuckers currently celebrating in my kitchen. I felt the last lingering threads of paternal guilt burn away, replaced by a terrifying, absolute clarity. Authorize it, I said, a dark smile finally touching the corners of my mouth. Let's burn his entire world to the ground. The first night in that shed was a masterclass in physical misery. The military surplus cot felt like sleeping on a spine of jagged rocks, and by high, Kume, M, the Tahoe air had dropped to a bone-chilling 40 degrees. I lay there in the dark, my breath pluming in the freezing air, wrapped in the single thin jacket I had brought from my suitcase. Every time I shifted, the canvas groaned loudly enough to startle the mice that were scurrying in the wall cavities. Through the cracked, grimy window pane, I had a front-row seat to my own replacement. The lights in my beautiful, custom-built home blazed like a beacon. I could hear the faint, pulsing bass of Curtis's stereo system vibrating across the lawn. They thought I was shivering in defeat. They assumed the shock of betrayal had broken my spirit, leaving me a confused, helpless old man waiting for the end. What they didn't realize was that the cold was doing me a favor. It kept me painfully awake. It kept my mind spinning like a diamond-tipped drill bit, calculating stress loads and structural weaknesses. Because if there is one thing an architect knows better than anyone else, it's how to find the exact microscopic fracture that will bring an entire building crashing down. I didn't know it yet, but the trap I had laid months ago was about to catch its first piece of meat. But to understand the sheer, breathtaking cruelty of what Daniela was doing, you have to understand who she used to be. Before the designer clothes and the dead, corporate stares, Daniela was my entire world. When my wife, Evelyn, passed away from ovarian cancer 15 years ago, our house felt like a tomb. Daniela was just 13. I remember sitting on the bathroom floor with her at 2 a.m, holding her while she sobbed until she threw up, promising her that I would never, ever leave her. I scaled back my firm. I turned down massive commercial contracts so I could be there to cook her breakfast, to help with her algebra homework, to attend every single agonizingly long middle school choir recital. I was both mother and father, and I wore those titles like a badge of honor. I kept asking myself, staring at the frost forming on the inside of the shed window when the poison took hold. The answer, of course, wore a custom suit and carried a pitch deck. Curtis Fowler slid into our lives 3 years ago, like a slow-acting virus. Daniela met him at a networking event in San Francisco. From the moment he first walked into my house, shaking my hand with that aggressive, over-rehearsed alpha male grip, my instincts screamed at me. He was too polished, too loud, too quick to drop names of venture capitalists he barely knew. He talked endlessly about disrupting markets and leveraging assets, but when you actually drilled down into what his companies produced, it was just vaporware, ghost algorithms, and empty promises. I should have shut the door on him then. I should have told my daughter he was a grifter looking for a meal ticket. But love makes you blind, and being a father to an adult daughter makes you stupid. She looked at him like he hung the moon. When he proposed 6 months later, I swallowed my misgivings and wrote a 6-figure check for a lavish wedding in Napa Valley, hoping I was wrong about him. I wasn't wrong. The early warning signs started about a year into their marriage. Curtis's revolutionary crypto trading platform collapsed, wiping out not just his money, but the investments of several very angry, very dangerous private backers. Daniela called me in hysterics one Sunday afternoon. They were being evicted from their luxury loft. The bank was circling. Could they please stay in my guest rooms just for a few months? Just until Curtis got his new consulting firm off the ground. The word temporary does a lot of heavy lifting when family is involved. The first month, they were polite guests. By month 3, the subtle invasion began. I'd come home from a walk to find my favorite leather armchair moved to the basement because it ruined the feng shui of the living room. The vintage jazz records I played on Sunday mornings were replaced by Curtis taking loud, aggressive pacing phone calls in the kitchen. The real breaking point, the moment the alarms in my head went from a gentle hum to a deafening roar, happened 4 months ago over dinner. I had cooked Evelyn's famous pot roast. Curtis was on his 3rd glass of my best Cabernet, swirling the wine aggressively. "You know, Walt," he had said casually, wiping his mouth, "the real estate market in Tahoe is peaking right now. Have you thought about your exit strategy for this property? I mean, holding on to an asset this size at your age is just bad capital management. If you transferred the deed to a trust managed by Danny and me, we could leverage the equity, build real generational wealth." He hadn't looked at me when he said it. He had looked at the walls. He was appraising the crown molding, calculating the square footage, pricing out my life's work. I looked at Daniela, waiting for her to defend me, to tell her husband that her father wasn't a real estate portfolio to be liquidated. But she just kept cutting her carrots, refusing to make eye contact. "It makes financial sense, Dad," she had mumbled. "It's practically a burden for you to maintain this place anyway." That was the night the father died, and the architect went to work. I didn't yell, I didn't argue. I just smiled, poured myself another glass of wine, and said I would think about it. The very next morning, I drove down to San Francisco and walked into the office of Gerald Martinez, the most ruthless, razor-sharp estate planning attorney on the West Coast. 3 days later, I hired Helen Clark, a former fraud detective turned private investigator, to start digging into Curtis's supposedly temporary financial dip. My trip to Hawaii wasn't a vacation. It was a tactical retreat. It was giving a greedy, impatient rat a massive piece of cheese and waiting for the trap to snap shut. And now, sitting in this freezing shed, I knew they had taken the bait completely. Suddenly, the single bulb hanging from the shed's ceiling flared to life, momentarily blinding me. I squinted against the harsh glare. Then, the power to the entire shed, the light, the single outlet where my burner phone was charging, died instantly. I stood up, my joints popping in the cold, and peered through the window. Standing on the back deck of the main house, illuminated by the porch lights, was Curtis. He had his hand resting on the exterior breaker box. He was looking directly across the lawn at the shed, a smug, satisfied smirk plastered across his face. He actually raised his wine glass in a mocking toast toward the darkness where he knew I was watching, then turned and walked back into my warm, fully lit house, sliding the glass door shut behind him. It was petty. It was a juvenile, cruel, little flex to remind me who held the power. He wanted me to freeze. He wanted me to feel small. I reached into the dark, feeling the cold metal of my Pelican case, and pulled out my Leica camera. I attached the heavy, specialized telephoto lens, the one I usually used for capturing eagles nesting across the lake. In the pitch black of the shed, I was practically invisible. I pressed the viewfinder to my eye and adjusted the focus ring. The glass elements shifted, bringing the interior of my living room into razor-sharp, cinematic clarity. I watched the rest of their evening unfold in high definition. I watched Daniela go to bed around midnight, rubbing her temples, looking stressed. I expected Curtis to follow her, but he didn't. Instead, he poured himself another drink, pulled out his phone, and started texting furiously. His posture changed. The arrogant swagger evaporated, replaced by a nervous, twitchy energy. He kept glancing toward the hallway to ensure Daniela was gone. My burner phone vibrated in my pocket. A single text from Helen. "Phase mode is active. Check your email when you get power." The financial report is ugly, Walter, but the personal report is going to break her heart. I didn't need the email to know what she meant, because what happened next changed the entire trajectory of my revenge. Through the telephoto lens, I watched a pair of headlights sweep across the front of my property. A white Tesla pulled halfway into the driveway and killed its lights. Curtis practically sprinted to the front door, opening it before the visitor could even knock. It wasn't one of his aggressive venture capital buddies. It wasn't an investor. A woman stepped into my foyer. She was young, maybe late 20s, with bright blonde hair and a designer trench coat. Curtis didn't shake her hand. He grabbed her by the waist, pulled her against him, and kissed her with a desperate, frantic hunger right there in the entryway, less than 50 feet from where his wife was sleeping. I kept my finger pressed on the shutter button. Click, click, click. The camera silently recorded every second of the betrayal. They moved into the living room, completely unbothered, unaware that the senile old man they had banished to the yard was documenting their destruction in 24 megapixels. I lowered the camera, the freezing air of the shed suddenly feeling a lot less oppressive. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. Curtis thought he was the smartest guy in the room. He thought he had outmaneuvered me, stolen my house, and secured his future. He didn't realize he was standing in the middle of a minefield, and I was holding the detonator. Tomorrow, the sun was going to rise, and the real demolition was going to begin. The blonde woman stayed until exactly bon a.m. I know, because I watched the glowing green numbers on my burner phone tick away the minutes, while the freezing Tahoe air turned my extremities completely numb. Through the telephoto lens, I documented every sickening moment of my son-in-law's extracurricular activities in the living room of the house I built. The betrayal was so multi-layered, it was almost suffocating. My daughter was upstairs, sleeping in the primary suite that used to belong to my late wife and me, while her husband defiled our home downstairs. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I couldn't. Not just because of the biting cold, but because the architect in me was already redrawing the blueprints of my revenge. At Sao Bamui in the morning, just as the sun began to paint the surface of the lake in brilliant streaks of orange and purple, the power in the shed suddenly surged back to life. The bare bulb overhead flickered, blindingly bright after hours of darkness. Curtis had flipped the breaker back on. A few minutes later, the back door of the main house opened, and he strolled out onto the deck in his expensive cashmere sweater, sipping a fresh coffee. He looked completely refreshed, the picture of a successful Silicon Valley consultant. He didn't know I was standing right at the glass, watching him with eyes that felt like they were full of sand. He just waved his coffee mug toward the shed with a sickeningly cheerful smile, playing the part of the gracious host who had just remembered to turn the heat back on for the family dog. My burner phone buzzed against my thigh. With the power restored, my cellular data had reconnected, and Helen's email had finally come through. The subject line simply read, "The foundation is rotting." I sat on the edge of the rigid canvas cot, my back screaming in protest, and opened the attached PDF. Helen had warned me the financial report was ugly, but what I read in those meticulously documented pages made my blood run ice cold. Curtis Fowler wasn't just a failed businessman, he was a walking financial catastrophe. He owed upwards of 10 bon mui, home to 3 different creditors. One of them was a highly aggressive private investor named Marcus Gray, who was already threatening a lawsuit. Another, Mocham Mui, home belonged to a venture capital firm that was 60 days away from seizing assets. But the real gut punch, the revelation that physically knocked the wind out of me, was on page 4. Curtis hadn't just ruined his own credit. He was actively destroying my daughter's. Helen had uncovered 4 different credit cards opened in Daniela's name over the past 18 months. The total balance was hovering around Samwibai, home. All the applications had been filed online, and all the physical statements were being routed to a private P.O. box that only Curtis had access to. He was forging her signature, leveraging her pristine credit score, and using the cash advances to fund his failing lifestyle. And that lifestyle included the blonde from last night. Her name was Jessica Vance. She was 28, technically employed as Curtis's executive assistant, though Helen's surveillance photos proved her duties were entirely extracurricular. Curtis was using the credit cards opened in my daughter's name to pay for luxury hotel rooms, expensive dinners, and jewelry for his mistress. I stared at the glowing screen of the phone until the text blurred. My daughter had thrown me to the wolves for a man who was systematically bleeding her dry and mocking her behind her back. Part of me, the dad who used to check under her bed for monsters, wanted to march up to that house, kick the door off its hinges, and shove this report in her face. I wanted to save her, but I hesitated, because right at that moment, the door to the shed creaked open. It was Daniela. She was holding a paper plate with a piece of cold, microwave toast and a single scrambled egg. She stepped into the shed, her nose wrinkling in immediate disgust at the smell of mildew and damp wood. She didn't look at the cot. She didn't look at my shivering frame. She just set the paper plate down on the edge of my workbench like she was delivering rations to a prisoner of war. "Morning, Dad," she said, her voice tight and overly bright. "Sorry about the power last night. Curtis said the old grid out here must have tripped. He's going to have an electrician look at it eventually." "The breaker is on the outside of the house, Danny," I said quietly, keeping my voice devoid of emotion. "You have to physically pull the lever to cut the power to this outbuilding." She blinked, a momentary flash of guilt crossing her eyes before the corporate mask slammed back into place. "Well, old houses have quirks. Anyway, I wanted to bring you breakfast and talk about the next steps in this transition." Transition? She made stripping a man of his home and dignity sound like a software update. She pulled a glossy, trifold brochure from the pocket of her designer cardigan and held it out to me. The cover featured a stock photo of two silver-haired actors laughing aggressively at a bingo card. The bold, cheerful font read, "Sunset Vista Senior Living, your next great adventure." "Curtis and I have been doing a lot of research," she said, folding her arms, completely ignoring the fact that I hadn't taken the brochure from her hand. "We really think the shed is just a temporary stepping stone. Sunset Vista is only 30 miles from here. They have a muy bon hour nursing staff, water aerobics, and a really robust memory care unit for for the future. And it's only bon high chum a month. Your pension and Social Security should cover most of it, and Curtis and I are willing to manage your finances to make sure the payment's clear." I looked from the brochure to my daughter's face. She wasn't just complicit, she was actively trying to warehouse me. They wanted to lock me in a mid-tier nursing facility, assume control of my monthly income to pay for it, and live rent-free in my multi-million-dollar lakefront home while preparing to sell it out from under me. "You want to put me in a home," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "It's not a home, Dad. It's an assisted living community," she corrected quickly, annoyed that I was resisting the narrative. "You're 68. You shouldn't be dealing with the stress of homeownership. Curtis has some legal documents for you to sign later today, just a standard quitclaim deed, to transfer the property to us so we can handle the taxes and maintenance. It's the smart thing to do. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." She dropped the brochure on top of the cold toast, turned on her heel, and walked out of the shed without looking back. I didn't realize it yet, but that was the last time I would ever look at her as my little girl. The empathy I had felt just moments prior, reading about Curtis's massive financial betrayal of her, evaporated into the freezing morning air. She had made her choice. She had looked at the man who raised her, saw nothing but an inconvenience holding a valuable deed, and decided to discard him. If she was going down with Curtis's sinking ship, I was no longer going to throw her a life preserver. The escalation began rapidly that afternoon. Around Moat, Hum P.M., a sleek silver Mercedes pulled into my driveway. A woman in a sharp business suit stepped out, carrying a leather portfolio. Even from the shed, my architect's eye recognized a real estate agent. I grabbed my camera, attached the telephoto lens, and positioned myself in the shadows of the shed's window. For the next hour, I documented everything. Through the expansive living room windows, I watched Curtis and Daniela sit at my custom dining table, the one I had carved from a single slab of reclaimed walnut with the agent. I zoomed in on the documents spread across the wood. It was a comparative market analysis. The bold numbers at the bottom of the page were impossible to miss. Hi-fi na muy million. Hi-fi by muy million. Curtis was leaning forward, nodding enthusiastically, his hands gesturing wildly as he pointed out the architectural features of my home. Daniela was taking notes, smiling the brightest smile I had seen from her in years. They were already spending the money in their heads. They were pricing out my life's work to cover Curtis's fraudulent debts, and they were popping champagne while doing it. I watched the agent leave, shaking Curtis's hand warmly. 5 minutes later, I decided it was time to test the perimeter of my new prison. I zipped up my jacket and walked across the lawn toward the garage. My customized SUV was parked inside, and I needed the heavy winter coat I kept in the trunk. But as I reached into my pocket for my keychain, my fingers met empty air. I patted down my jeans. Nothing. I checked my suitcase in the shed. Nothing. A cold spike of adrenaline hit my system. I marched up the steps of the back deck and pounded on the sliding glass door. Curtis appeared a moment later, unlocking the door and sliding it open just a few inches. He was holding my keychain, casually spinning it around his index finger. The silver metal caught the afternoon sun. "Looking for these, Walt?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "Give me my keys, Curtis." "See, here's the problem," he sighed, leaning against the doorframe. Danny and I are really worried about your cognitive state. You've been very forgetful lately. The state of California frowns on elderly citizens with declining mental faculties operating heavy machinery. We'd feel terrible if you caused an accident. I am in perfect health, and you are holding my stolen property. Hand them over, or I'm calling the police." Curtis's eyes darkened, the playful facade dropping instantly. The cornered, desperate debtor underneath finally showed his face. "Call them," he challenged, stepping closer to the screen. "Tell them you're living in a shed, and you're confused about where you parked. I'll show them the videos I took of you wandering the yard last night in the freezing cold looking through our windows. I'll show them the quitclaim deed you're supposed to sign. Who do you think they're going to believe, Walter? The successful business consultant and your own flesh-and-blood daughter? Or the erratic old man who refuses to go to a memory care facility?" He pocketed the keys. "Tomorrow morning, I'm bringing the transfer paperwork to the shed," he said, his voice dropping to a low, venomous threat. "You are going to sign it. Because if you don't, I'm locking the gate, shutting off the power permanently, and we'll see how long it takes for Adult Protective Services to drag you out of here in a straitjacket." He slammed the sliding door in my face and threw the deadbolt. I stood on the deck, the cold wind whipping off the lake and biting into my face. I was trapped. No car, no keys, locked out of my home, and threatened with forced institutionalization by my own family. Any normal man would have broken right there. They would have pounded on the glass, screamed, cried, or surrendered. But as I turned around and walked slowly back to the shed, I pulled the burner phone from my pocket. I opened my messages and typed a single line to my attorney, Gerald Martinez. "The demolition begins tomorrow. Bring the wrecking ball." What Curtis and Daniela didn't know was that while they were busy changing the locks on the doors, I had already changed the foundation of the earth beneath their feet. And tomorrow, they were going to step right off the cliff. The human body is remarkably adaptable to physical suffering. By my third day in the shed, my muscles had stopped shivering and instead settled into a permanent, dull ache. I learned to sleep in 2-hour shifts, waking up right before the cold could sink deep enough into my bones to do permanent damage. But while you can adapt to a freezing concrete floor, you never adapt to the psychological weight of knowing your own flesh and blood put you there. I didn't know it yet, but Curtis was about to host the most expensive mistake of his life, and he was going to use me as the centerpiece. It started on Friday afternoon. A fleet of white catering vans pulled into my widened driveway, tires rolling right over the fresh asphalt that used to be my wife's rose garden. For the next 5 hours, a small army of staff transformed my property. They erected a massive, heated pavilion tent on the back lawn, draped my deck in expensive string lights, and carried crates of top-shelf liquor into my kitchen. Curtis was throwing a party, not just a casual get-together, but a high-end networking event to impress his so-called venture capital investors. He was bleeding money he didn't have, likely maxing out the fraudulent credit cards in my daughter's name, all to maintain the illusion of success. From my vantage point in the freezing shed, the smell of seared tenderloin and rosemary drifted through the cracked window pane. My stomach twisted. I had been surviving on protein bars from my suitcase, and the occasional paper plate of cold leftovers Daniela would silently leave on the shed's steps. I thought I had seen the absolute bottom of their depravity. I was wrong. The real humiliation was scheduled for Tam, Hong Pam. The bass from the sound system was vibrating the rusted nails in the shed's walls when the heavy wooden door was suddenly kicked open. I blinked against the harsh patio lights. Curtis stood in the doorway, wearing a bespoke navy tuxedo jacket. Flanking him were 2 younger men, early 30s, holding rocks glasses filled with scotch. They were looking at me the way you look at an animal in a petting zoo. "There he is," Curtis announced, his words slightly slurred. The aggressive confidence of alcohol radiated off him. "The man of the hour. Come on out, Walt. Time to be social." I sat up on the canvas cot, my breath pluming in the cold air. "I'm perfectly fine here, Curtis." "It wasn't a request, old man." His smile didn't reach his eyes. He stepped into the shed, the stench of expensive cologne masking the mildew, and grabbed me firmly by the bicep. His fingers dug in hard enough to bruise. "I have investors out there who want to meet the genius architect who decided to embrace the minimalist, tiny home lifestyle. Don't make me drag you." I could have fought him. I could have caused a scene, yelled for the caterers to call the police. But the architect in me knew better. When you want to prove a building is structurally unsound, you don't stop the stress test halfway. You let the pressure build until the microscopic fractures are visible to everyone. I needed Curtis to feel completely untouchable. Lead the way, I said quietly, pulling my arm out of his grip. Walking across the lawn and stepping through the sliding glass door into my own home was a surreal, out-of-body experience. The heat of the house hit me like a physical wall. The living room was packed with at least 40 people in cocktail attire, sipping my liquor and laughing loudly over the jazz quartet playing in the corner. But what made my chest tighten wasn't the strangers. It was what they had done to the space. My vintage Leica camera collection, the one that had sat on the custom oak shelving for a decade, was completely gone. In its place were generic, framed motivational quotes and a row of Curtis's cheap golf trophies. The abstract oil paintings I had sourced from local Tahoe artists had been swapped for soulless, corporate-style canvas prints. They had surgically removed every trace of my existence. And then I saw Daniela. She was standing by the kitchen island, holding a champagne flute, laughing politely at a joke told by a man I recognized from Helen's file as Marcus Gray, the private investor Curtis. Ode mo chum hai mui. Hum. She was wearing a stunning, backless evening gown. But my eyes immediately locked onto her right wrist, and my heart completely stopped beating. Sparkling under the recessed lighting was a vintage, platinum diamond tennis bracelet. It was Evelyn's. I had bought it for my late wife on our 20th anniversary. After she passed, I had locked it in the heavy floor safe in the primary bedroom, explicitly telling Daniela that it would be hers on her 40th birthday, when she was mature enough to appreciate its history. They had cracked my safe. My daughter was casually wearing a piece of her dead mother's legacy to a fraudulent networking party funded by stolen money. The physical pain of that realization was so intense I actually stumbled. My daughter wasn't just blind to her husband's schemes, she was actively looting the graves of her past. Any lingering hesitation I had about destroying her along with Curtis vanished in that exact second. Curtis grabbed a butter knife and began clinking it aggressively against his crystal tumbler. The room gradually fell silent, all eyes turning toward us. "Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming," Curtis beamed, throwing his free arm heavily around my shoulders. He squeezed my neck in a vice grip. "A lot of you have been asking about the incredible property we're hosting you in tonight. Daniela and I are thrilled to officially announce that we are taking over the estate, and I want to give a special toast to my father-in-law, Walter, here." He gestured to me, an exhausted man in wrinkled jeans and a faded jacket, standing under the glaring lights. "Walter is a pioneer," Curtis continued, playing to the crowd. "While most guys his age are draining resources in massive houses, Walter insisted on moving into our newly renovated outdoor studio. He wanted to embrace a simpler, off-the-grid lifestyle so the younger generation could thrive. To Walter. To Walter, the crowd echoed, a mix of nervous laughter and genuine applause filling the room. People actually raised their glasses to me, believing this sick, twisted narrative. I looked at Daniela. She finally met my eyes, her cheeks flushed with champagne. She quickly looked down at the floor, rotating her mother's diamond bracelet nervously. As the applause died down, Curtis leaned in close to my ear. The smile remained plastered on his face for the guests, but his voice was pure poison. "You see these people, Walter," he whispered. "They're backing my next venture. But to secure the capital, I need the deed to this house filed as collateral by Monday morning. I'm bringing the quitclaim papers to the shed tomorrow at Moore. Hung A.M. sharp. You are going to sign them. If you refuse, I make the call to the state. You get hauled off to a psychiatric ward, and I take the rest of your dead wife's jewelry to a pawn shop to cover the legal fees of the conservatorship." What happened next was my finest piece of acting. I let my shoulders slump. I let my eyes widen in terror. I let my jaw tremble just enough to sell the image of a completely broken, defeated old man who had finally realized he had no way out. "Don't sell her things," I pleaded softly, ensuring my voice sounded frail and pathetic. "Please, Curtis, I'll do it. Bring the papers tomorrow morning. I'll sign the house over." Curtis's eyes widened in sheer, predatory delight. The adrenaline rush of complete victory washed over his face. He patted my cheek condescendingly. "I knew you'd finally see reason, Walt. Now, go back outside. You're bringing down the vibe of the party." I turned and walked back out the sliding glass door, the laughter and jazz music fading behind me as the freezing night air hit my lungs. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I walked straight into the dark, damp shed, sat on the miserable canvas cot, and pulled out my burner phone. My fingers were steady as stone as I typed the message to Gerald Martinez. He's taken the bait entirely. He wants the deed tomorrow at Moor. Home, it's time to drop the hammer. Gerald's response came less than a minute later. I'll be parked down the street at Chin. Bamui. Helen is on standby. Sleep well, Walter. Tomorrow, you get your house back. I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, watching the lights of the party blaze until high. I watched the catering vans pack up and leave. I watched the last of the drunk investors stumble to their Ubers. I sat there in the freezing silence, feeling a profound, terrifying sense of peace. The trap was set. The structural integrity of Curtis's lies was holding entirely on one single, invisible stress point, a point I was about to shatter. When the sun finally rose over Lake Tahoe, casting a brilliant golden light across the frost-covered grass, I stood up. I packed my few belongings into my suitcase. I straightened my jacket, took a deep breath of the crisp morning air, and walked out of the shed for what I knew would be the last time. I checked my watch. It was Chin. Bon muy lama. Gerald would be waiting just out of sight. I walked confidently across the lawn, my footsteps crunching on the frosted grass, ready to end this nightmare and unleash a legal hurricane on my son-in-law. But as I stepped onto the wooden planks of the back deck and looked through the sliding glass door, my blood ran completely cold. The rules of engagement had suddenly changed. Curtis hadn't waited for Mui, Hong'e. He was sitting at the kitchen island, but he wasn't alone with Daniela. Sitting across from them, unpacking a leather briefcase, was the real estate agent from 2 days ago. And next to her was a man in a cheap suit, setting down an ink pad and a brass stamp, a state-licensed notary public. Curtis hadn't just arranged for me to sign a piece of paper. He had brought the buyers, the agent, and the legal witness to execute the sale of my house on the spot. He saw me through the glass, shot me a terrifying, triumphant grin, and waved me inside to face the firing squad. The slide of the heavy glass door on its tracks sounded like a vault sealing shut. As I stepped from the freezing deck into the warmth of my own kitchen, the smell of freshly brewed espresso and expensive stale catering food from the night before washed over me. The contrast between the freezing shed and this multi-million-dollar sanctuary was jarring, but I didn't let my posture shift. I kept my shoulders slumped. I let my hands tremble just a fraction. I played the part of the broken man walking to the gallows, because a trap only works if the prey feels completely safe. Curtis was leaning against the marble island, radiating a terrifying manic energy. He had traded his tuxedo for a sharp, tailored gray suit, looking every bit the Silicon Valley heavyweight. To his right stood the real estate agent from 2 days ago, a sleek woman with a tight smile, clutching a leather binder. Next to her was an older man in a cheap windbreaker, meticulously lining up a brass notary stamp and a logbook on my kitchen counter. "There he is," Curtis said, his voice dripping with a fake, saccharine warmth meant entirely for his audience. He walked over and gently guided me by the elbow toward the island, playing the role of the devoted, heartbreakingly patient son-in-law. "Take a seat, Walt. Can I get you some water? I know mornings are getting a little confusing for you." I didn't answer. I just slowly sat on one of the leather bar stools I had custom ordered from Italy. "Mr. Stanley, it's a pleasure to meet you," the real estate agent said, offering a sympathetic, practiced smile. "I'm Brenda. Curtis and Daniela have told me so much about your situation. I just want to say I think it's incredibly brave of you to recognize when a property this large becomes too much to handle. Transitioning to a managed care facility is a big step, but it's the right one." I looked across the island at Daniela. She was wearing a thick cashmere sweater, clutching a mug of tea with both hands. Her eyes were bloodshot, probably from a hangover, but the platinum and diamond tennis bracelet, my late wife's bracelet, was still fastened securely around her wrist. It caught the recessed lighting, flashing with a brilliant, mocking fire. "Is that what they told you, Brenda?" I asked, my voice raspy. "That I'm transitioning?" "Dad, please," Daniela interjected, her voice tight with anxiety. "Let's just get this over with. Curtis has the paperwork ready. The sooner we do this, the sooner you can get settled into your new space." Curtis smoothly slid a thick stack of papers across the marble countertop. He tapped the top page with a heavy gold pen. I looked down. It wasn't just a quitclaim deed. Beneath the transfer documents was a standard California residential purchase agreement. My eyes scanned the numbers immediately. Curtis wasn't just trying to put the house in his name to take out a loan. He was executing a fire sale. The purchase price was listed at $1.5 million, an all-cash offer from a corporate LLC, closing in 5 days. He was leaving nearly $1 million in equity on the table just to liquidate my life's work instantly. That was how desperate he was. The venture capital firm and his private investors were breathing down his neck, and he needed cash before the weekend was over. "It's very simple, Walt," Curtis murmured, leaning in close so the notary wouldn't hear the venom in his tone. "Sign the quitclaim. Brenda's buyer wires the earnest money into our account by noon. We all walk away happy, and I don't have to make that phone call to Adult Protective Services." He pressed the heavy gold pen into my hand. I didn't know it yet, but the look on his face in that exact fraction of a second, the absolute, arrogant certainty of a con man who believes he has just stolen a fortune, would be burned into my memory for the rest of my life, because it was the last time Curtis Fowler would ever smile at me. "Brenda," I said, setting the gold pen down on the marble with a soft click. "As a licensed real estate professional in the state of California, did you run a preliminary title search on this property before bringing a cash buyer to the table?" Brenda's sympathetic smile faltered slightly. She glanced at Curtis, suddenly unsure of the dynamic. "Well, Mr. Stanley," Curtis assured me, "the quitclaim was a mere formality, being executed today. Usually we wait for escrow to open to pull the full title report, but given the all-cash nature of the wholesale offer—" "So you didn't look," I interrupted, my voice dropping the frail, raspy act entirely. It resonated through the kitchen, firm, sharp, and authoritative. The voice of a man who used to command boardrooms and construction sites. Curtis's eyes snapped toward me, his brow furrowing. "Walt, stop playing games, sign the paper." "I can't sign it, Curtis," I said, reaching inside my faded jacket. "Not because I don't want to, but because transferring this property via a quitclaim deed would be a federal crime, and I'd hate to make Brenda and this lovely notary accessories to real estate fraud." The room went dead silent, the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that precedes a massive avalanche. I pulled a folded, thick legal document from my inner pocket. It bore the raised gold seal of the state and the signature of a county clerk. I didn't hand it to my son-in-law. I slid it directly across the marble island to Brenda. "Read the name of the deed holder," I instructed her. Brenda frowned, opening the document. Her eyes scanned the legal jargon, and I watched in real time as the blood completely drained from her face. Her tanned complexion turned the color of old parchment. "It says, 'The property is owned by the Stanley Educational Trust,'" Brenda stammered, her voice trembling. She looked up at me, panic flaring in her eyes. "An irrevocable living trust." "Exactly," I said, leaning forward, resting my forearms on the island. "I created that trust 3 months ago. The house at Hangin Tamcham Bonmui by Lakeshore Boulevard belongs to the trust. I am merely the lifetime beneficiary, meaning I have the legal right to reside here until my death. Upon my passing, the estate is automatically donated to a charitable foundation that funds architectural scholarships." I turned my head slowly, locking eyes with Curtis. His jaw had literally fallen open. His face was cycling through emotions so fast it looked like a glitching screen: confusion, disbelief, and finally, a sheer, unadulterated terror. "Which means," I continued softly, "I don't own this house. I cannot give it to you. I cannot sell it to you. And that piece of paper you printed off the internet is completely, entirely worthless." "No," Daniela breathed, taking a step back from the island, her hand flying to her mouth. "Dad, what did you do?" "I built a foundation that couldn't be undermined, Danny," I said, staring at my dead wife's bracelet on her wrist. "Something your husband clearly knows nothing about." Brenda scrambled backward, her chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. In the real estate world, knowingly participating in the attempted sale of a property without the legal owner's consent is a career-ending felony. She shoved the purchase agreement and the quitclaim deed back toward Curtis like they were on fire. "I am withdrawing my buyer's offer immediately," Brenda practically shouted, her professional demeanor completely shattered. "Mr. Fowler, you lied to me. You explicitly stated your father-in-law held the deed free and clear. Do not ever contact my agency again." She grabbed her leather binder and practically sprinted for the front door. The notary, realizing he was sitting in the blast radius of a massive legal liability, didn't even speak. He just swept his stamp and logbook into his satchel and followed Brenda out, slamming the heavy oak door shut behind them. Then, there were 3. The silence in the kitchen was deafening, broken only by the hum of the luxury refrigerator. Curtis stood frozen over the useless documents. His breathing was shallow and rapid, his chest heaving under his tailored suit. His brain was desperately trying to calculate a way out, to find a loophole, but the math was fatal. The $1 million lifeline he needed to stop the venture capital sharks from tearing him apart had just evaporated into thin air. "You set me up," Curtis finally hissed, his voice vibrating with a primal, barely contained rage. His hands gripped the edge of the marble island so hard his knuckles turned stark white. "You senile, vindictive old piece of trash. You set me up." "I simply secured my assets," I corrected, standing up to my full height. The aches in my joints were completely gone, masked by a tidal wave of pure adrenaline. When I saw a rat eyeing the pantry, I put the food in a lockbox. "It's not my fault you broke your teeth trying to bite through the steel." "I'll break the trust," Curtis screamed, completely losing his composure, slamming his fist onto the marble. The espresso cups rattled violently. "I'll hire the best probate litigator in California. I'll prove you signed it under duress. I'll prove you have dementia. I'll drag you through court until you die of old age." "With what money, Curtis?" The voice didn't come from me. It came from the hallway. Curtis and Daniela whipped their heads around. Standing in the archway of the kitchen was Gerald Martinez, my attorney, looking impeccably sharp in a charcoal suit. Beside him stood Helen Clark, the private investigator, holding a massive, overstuffed manila folder. I had given Gerald my spare house key months ago, and their timing was nothing short of cinematic. "A probate litigator of that caliber requires a retainer of at least $50,000, Gerald said smoothly, walking into the kitchen like he owned it. He pulled a crisp, white document from his breast pocket and laid it precisely on top of Curtis's useless quitclaim deed. "And given that you currently owe Marcus Gray $120,000 and Apex Investments another $150,000, I highly doubt you can afford the parking fee at the courthouse." Daniela let out a choked gasp. What did he just say? "Curtis, what is he talking about? Apex Investments?" Curtis backed away from the island, his eyes darting frantically between Gerald, Helen, and me. He looked like a trapped animal looking for a window to crash through. "Danny, don't listen to them. They're lying. It's a psychological tactic." "We don't deal in tactics, Mr. Fowler," Helen said, stepping forward. Her voice was flat, clinical, and completely devoid of mercy. She slapped the thick manila folder onto the marble counter. It hit the stone with a heavy, authoritative thud. "We deal in documentation." Helen looked directly at my daughter. "Daniela, my name is Helen Clark. Your father hired me to look into your husband's financial stability. The man you are married to is currently $340,000 in debt. His business is a shell company. He is facing imminent litigation for fraud from his private investors." "That's a lie!" Curtis yelled, stepping toward Helen, his face purple with rage. "You can't come into my house, and—" "It is not your house," Gerald barked, his voice echoing off the high ceilings with the force of a judge's gavel. He pointed to the white document he had just placed on the counter. "That is an official, court-stamped notice to quit. You and your wife have been residing unlawfully in property owned by the Stanley Educational Trust. You are officially categorized as hostile trespassers. You have exactly 30 days to vacate this premises, or the El Dorado County Sheriff's Department will physically remove you and your belongings to the curb." I watched my daughter physically crumble. The arrogant, corporate shell she had worn for months cracked and shattered. She leaned heavily against the back counter, tears welling in her eyes as the reality of her husband's financial ruin washed over her. "Curtis," Daniela sobbed, shaking her head. "Is it true? Are we bankrupt? Is it true?" But the demolition wasn't finished. We had only knocked out the load-bearing walls. It was time to shatter the foundation. "The bankruptcy is the least of your concerns, Daniela," I said softly, stepping around the island. I looked at the manila folder Helen had dropped on the counter, because while Curtis was busy losing hundreds of thousands of dollars of investor money, he was also busy spending yours. I slid the folder toward her. Curtis realized exactly what was in that folder. The credit card statements, the fraudulent signatures, the high-definition, telephoto images of him violently making out with his 28-year-old assistant in my foyer just 30 hours ago. "Don't look at it," Curtis roared. With a guttural cry of pure panic, Curtis lunged across the marble island. He scrambled wildly, his tailored suit jacket knocking over the espresso mugs, sending dark, scalding coffee spraying across the pristine white stone, desperately reaching to snatch the folder before my daughter could open it. Curtis's lunge was fueled by pure, unadulterated panic, but he was a venture capitalist who spent his days in air-conditioned boardrooms, not a fighter. Helen Clark, on the other hand, was 20 years a fraud detective for the Sacramento PD before she went private. As Curtis scrambled over the marble, his manicured hands grasping for the manila envelope, Helen didn't even flinch. She simply stepped sideways, caught him by the wrist of his extended arm, and used his own momentum against him. With a sharp, practiced twist, she redirected his weight. Curtis crashed hard into the edge of the island, his tailored suit soaking up the puddle of spilled, scalding espresso. The folder slipped from Helen's grasp during the scuffle, hitting the hardwood floor with a heavy smack. The clasp broke. I watched, feeling a cold, hollow ache in my chest, as the meticulously documented wreckage of my daughter's marriage slid across the floorboards. Bank statements, collection notices, and worst of all, the 8x10 glossy photographs Helen had developed. They spread out like a deck of tarot cards predicting absolute ruin. Daniela slowly sank to her knees. She didn't look at her husband, who was currently groaning and clutching his bruised ribs against the cabinets. Her eyes were locked onto the photographs. Right on top of the pile was the high-definition shot I had taken myself just 30 hours prior. It captured Curtis in our front foyer, his hands tangled in the blonde hair of his 28-year-old assistant, Jessica, locked in a desperate, passionate kiss. Beside it lay a dozen other photos from Helen's surveillance. Curtis and Jessica sharing dessert at a dimly lit restaurant in Truckee. Curtis and Jessica walking into a boutique hotel in Reno. Curtis buying her a diamond pendant at a jewelry store, a pendant likely paid for with Daniela's forged credit. "Danny," Curtis gasped, spitting a mouthful of coffee-stained saliva onto the floor. He tried to push himself up, his eyes wide, the mask of the confident CEO completely replaced by the frantic desperation of a cornered rat. "Danny, don't look at those. They're out of context. They're doctored. Your dad hates me. You know he does. He paid someone to fake these." I didn't say a word. I just let the silence in the room suffocate his lie. Daniela's hands were shaking so violently that when she picked up the photograph, the glossy paper rattled. She stared at the image of her husband kissing another woman, and I watched the last remaining pillar of her reality snap. A low, ragged sound tore from her throat, a sound that didn't sound human. It was the sound of a heart physically breaking. "She has the same trench coat," Daniela whispered, her voice completely hollow. Curtis froze. "What?" "The trench coat in this picture," Daniela said, looking up at him, her mascara beginning to run down her pale cheeks. "I found a receipt for a Burberry trench coat in your jacket pocket 4 months ago. When I asked you about it, you said it was a corporate gift for a female investor. You bought your mistress a $3,000 coat while we were living in my father's guest room. When a narcissist is caught dead to rights, they never apologize. They pivot to attack. I had seen it in bad contractors trying to hide structural flaws, and I was seeing it now in my son-in-law. You want to talk about living situations?" Curtis spat, his face twisting into an ugly, vicious sneer. He pushed himself off the floor, pointing a trembling finger at her. "You forced me to move into this museum with your overbearing, suffocating father. I was stressed, Danny. My companies were under attack. We had no privacy, and you were always taking his side. Jessica actually listened to me. She supported my vision when you were too busy complaining about our lack of space." "She supported your vision?" I interjected, my voice cutting through his tantrum like a surgical scalpel. I stepped around the island, looking down at my daughter, who was now picking up the bank statements. "Is that what she was doing when you opened 4 separate credit cards in Daniela's name to fund your hotel rooms, Curtis?" Daniela stopped breathing. She dropped the photo and picked up the credit card statements. Her eyes darted across the pages, reading the balances. 15,000, 22,000, 18,000. Identity theft, Helen stated clinically, crossing her arms. "Section Namui of the California Penal Code. He forged your signature online, routed the physical mail to a P.O. box in South Lake Tahoe, and used your pristine credit score to fund his affair and keep his shell company afloat. You are currently $67,000 in debt, Mrs. Fowler." "No," Daniela choked out, dropping the papers as if they had burned her. "No, I didn't authorize this. I never signed anything. Curtis, tell them you didn't do this. Tell them." But I wasn't finished. "When you bring down a condemned building, you don't leave half the walls standing." "I thought the credit card fraud was the killing blow," I said quietly, looking at my attorney. "Gerald, show her the new discovery." Gerald Martinez reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a single, folded sheet of blue legal paper. He didn't hand it to Curtis. He crouched down and gently handed it to Daniela. Helen dug a little deeper into the "Mo chum hai mui, home debt your husband owes to Marcus Gray," Gerald explained, his tone shifting to that of a grim prosecutor. "Marcus Gray is not a venture capitalist, Daniela. He operates what the state calls a hard money lending syndicate. He provides immediate, high-interest cash loans to desperate people who have been blacklisted by traditional banks. He is also currently under investigation by the FBI for extortion and racketeering." Daniela looked at the document, completely overwhelmed. I don't understand. What does this have to do with me?" "Look at page 2, Gerald instructed softly, the signature line. I watched my daughter flip the page. Her breath hitched. There, directly beneath Curtis's messy scrawl, was her own name, perfectly forged. "Curtis didn't just borrow money from a very dangerous man," I said, feeling a heavy weight of sorrow beneath my rage. "He made you the personal guarantor of the loan. If Curtis defaults, which he officially just did, because he can't sell my house to pay Marcus back, Marcus Gray is legally entitled to come after your assets, your wages, and your future to collect his money. And men like Marcus don't just send polite collection letters." The kitchen spun into absolute chaos. Daniela let out a blood-curdling scream of pure anguish and threw the blue paper at Curtis's face. She scrambled to her feet, lunging at him, pounding her fists blindly against his chest. "You ruined me," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You forged my name to a loan shark. You cheated on me. You stole from my father. You sociopathic monster. You ruined my entire life." Curtis grabbed her wrists, shoving her back hard enough that she stumbled against the refrigerator. "Get off me. I did what I had to do to keep us afloat. We were supposed to flip this house. If your senile old man hadn't been hoarding this property in a secret trust, none of this would be an issue. He's the one destroying us." Daniela spun around, her tear-streaked face turning to me. She looked like the terrified little girl who used to wake up from nightmares, begging me to turn on the closet light. "Dad," she sobbed, taking a step toward me, reaching out her hand. "Dad, please, you have money. You have the retirement accounts. You have to help me. Marcus Gray is going to ruin me. I'll go to jail for the credit cards. Please, Daddy, pay the loan off. I'll divorce him, I promise. Just please save me." It was the hardest thing I have ever done in my 68 years on this earth. Every paternal instinct in my DNA screamed at me to wrap my arms around her, to write the check, to make the bad men go away. But I looked at her wrist. I looked at Evelyn's vintage diamond tennis bracelet, gleaming under the lights. The bracelet she was wearing to a fraudulent party hosted by a man who had exiled me to a freezing, rat-infested shed. I took a deliberate step backward, out of her reach. "No," I said. The word fell like a heavy stone into a deep well. Daniela froze, her hand still outstretched in the air. "What?" "I am not writing a check to the man who locked me out of my own home," I said, my voice eerily calm. "I am not bailing out the daughter who handed me brochures for a nursing home while she planned to sell my life's work. You made your bed, Daniela. You chose the luxury lifestyle. You chose the venture capital dreams. You chose him over me." "I didn't know," she wailed, dropping to her knees again, burying her face in her hands. "I didn't know how bad it was." "You knew I was sleeping on a military cot in a freezing barn," I replied, my tone hardening to steel. "You knew that much, and you didn't care. Actions have structural consequences, Danny. You let this man build a house of cards, and now you have to sit in the rubble." Curtis, watching this exchange, suddenly let out a sharp, barking laugh. It was a terrifying sound. It was the laugh of a man who realized the parachute had failed, the ground was rushing up to meet him, and he had absolutely nothing left to lose. He leaned against the counter, wiping the spilled espresso off his suit jacket, a twisted, maniacal grin spreading across his face. "You think you're so smart, Walt," Curtis chuckled, his eyes wide and completely unhinged. "You think you protected your precious assets with your little trust. You think you won. You're being evicted, bankrupt, and exposed," Gerald said flatly. "I'd say Mr. Stanley won quite decisively." "Did he?" Curtis tilted his head, looking directly at the diamond bracelet on Daniela's wrist. "Hey, Danny, tell your dad why you're wearing that bracelet today. Tell him why you suddenly decided to break it out of the master bedroom safe after ignoring it for 5 years." Daniela sniffled, looking up through her tears, completely confused. I just wanted to feel close to my mom. Things have been so stressful. Is that right? Curtis grinned, a predator playing with its food. He looked at me. She thinks she randomly decided to wear it. But the truth is, Walt, she wore it today because it's the only piece of jewelry left in the house. My heart stuttered. The air in the kitchen instantly grew cold. What are you talking about? I demanded. Margin calls are a bitch, Walter, Curtis sneered, reveling in the sudden shift in power. 2 weeks ago, before you even got back from Hawaii, Apex Investments threatened to freeze my operating accounts. I needed 60 grand in liquid cash, within 4 hours, just to keep the lights on. He walked slowly toward Daniela, looking down at her kneeling on the floor. Your wall safe wasn't nearly as high-tech as you thought, old man, Curtis said, his voice dripping with malice. The master code was Daniela's birthday. Pathetic. I cleared it out. The emerald earrings, the ruby pendant, the vintage Rolex, the pearl choker, all of Evelyn's precious little heirlooms. You stole my mother's jewelry, Daniela whispered, her eyes widening in sheer horror. You sold it? I pawned it, Curtis corrected, laughing again. To a broker in Reno who doesn't ask questions. He gave me pennies on the dollar, but it was enough to buy me a few more weeks. I felt a blinding, white-hot rage spike behind my eyes. The house was one thing. The house was wood, stone, and glass. But Evelyn's jewelry, those were the physical memories of the woman I loved. I will have you arrested for grand larceny before the sun sets, I promised him, my voice vibrating with a lethal intensity. Helen, call the police right now. Go ahead, Curtis shouted, throwing his arms wide open, his eyes wild with absolute lunacy. Call them. Have me arrested. But you might want to ask Helen how pawn shop documentation works in the state of Nevada before you dial Chinchambwimort. Helen froze, her hand hovering over her phone. She looked at Curtis, her seasoned detective instincts catching the trap. Curtis pointed a finger directly at Daniela's tear-stained face. I didn't use my own ID to pawn the jewelry, Walter, Curtis whispered, delivering the final devastating blow. I used Daniela's driver's license. I used her signature. The Reno broker has her on file as the sole seller of the stolen goods. So, if you call the cops to report the theft, I'm not the one going to prison for grand larceny. Your precious daughter is. The air in my kitchen turned to lead. Curtis's threat hung in the space between us, dripping with a venom so pure it was almost suffocating. He hadn't just pawned Evelyn's jewelry to cover his fraudulent debts. He had actively, maliciously laid a trap to ensure that if he went down, he would drag my only child into a concrete cell right alongside him. Daniela looked like she had been physically struck. She slumped against the refrigerator, her hands gripping the stainless steel handles just to keep her legs from giving out. She was hyperventilating, her eyes darting frantically between her husband and the manila envelope scattered across the hardwood floor. You used my ID, she whispered, her voice cracking in absolute horror. You took my driver's license out of my purse. You sold my dead mother's heirlooms, and you forged my name to take the fall for grand larceny. I protected our future, Curtis snapped, pointing an accusing finger at her. His tailored suit was still dripping with dark espresso, his perfectly coiffed hair falling into his wild, desperate eyes. I took a calculated risk. If you and your father had just signed the house over like normal people, I could have bought the jewelry back from the broker before anyone even noticed. This is his fault. He turned his manic gaze back to me, a sickeningly triumphant grin stretching across his face. He thought he had me boxed in. He thought he had found the ultimate leverage. My daughter's freedom in exchange for my silence and my fortune. So, what's it going to be, Walt? Curtis taunted, leaning against the marble island, crossing his arms. You call the cops, and Danny gets arrested for pawning stolen goods across state lines. Or, you authorize Gerald to dissolve the trust. You sign the deed over to me right now, and I make sure Marcus Gray doesn't break both of Danny's kneecaps. Your move, architect. I stared at him. The rage boiling inside me was so intense it felt cold, like liquid nitrogen coursing through my veins. But before I could speak, a sound cut through the heavy tension of the kitchen. It was a laugh, a dry, humorless, metallic chuckle that sounded like a shovel hitting frozen dirt. We all turned to look at Helen. The former fraud detective wasn't panicking. She wasn't intimidated. She was looking at Curtis, the way a scientist looks at a particularly stupid insect trapped in a jar. You really think you're the smartest guy in the room, don't you, Mr. Fowler? Helen asked, slowly crouching down to gather the scattered documents from the floor. I know I am, Curtis sneered. My plan is bulletproof. The Reno broker has her signature. Let me tell you a little something about Nevada Revised Statute. Sauchambonmui Saufei Helen said, standing up and brushing off her slacks. She held a single, glossy photograph in her hand. High-end pawnbrokers in Reno don't just take a signature and a plastic ID when you're offloading $50,000 worth of vintage diamonds. The state requires a biometric right thumbprint on the pawn ticket, and every transaction desk is equipped with Bon-K, high-definition facial capture cameras. I watched the smug confidence on Curtis's face flicker. Just a fraction, but it was there. The first microscopic crack in his load-bearing wall. I already ran the pawn tickets, Helen continued, her voice clinical and entirely devoid of mercy. I ran them 3 days ago when I noticed the jewelry missing from your wife's insurance inventory. And you're right, Curtis. You didn't show up on camera. And someone using Daniela's ID did. Helen flipped the photograph around and slapped it face up onto the marble island. Daniela let out a choked gasp. It was a still frame from a high-definition security camera. Standing at the pawn shop counter, handing Evelyn's emerald earrings to a broker, was a woman. She was wearing Daniela's distinctive Burberry trench coat. She had presented Daniela's driver's license, but the face looking up at the security camera didn't belong to my daughter. It was Jessica Vance, the 28-year-old executive assistant, the mistress. You didn't send your wife, Helen said, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. You sent your girlfriend. You had her wear your wife's coat, use your wife's stolen ID, and provide her own biometric thumbprint to a state database to sell stolen goods, which elevates this from a simple grand larceny to interstate wire fraud, conspiracy, and federal identity theft. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. Curtis stared at the photograph of his mistress. His jaw went slack. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of wet ash. The illusion of his genius had just been shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He hadn't trapped us. He had walked himself and his mistress directly into a federal indictment carrying a minimum sentence of 15 years. Checkmate, Gerald said softly, adjusting his suit tie. I'm calling the authorities. That was the exact moment the venture capitalist died, and a cornered, violent animal took his place. Curtis let out a primal, guttural scream. It wasn't a word. It was just a sound of pure, explosive panic. He blindly swept his arm across the marble island, sending the espresso machine, the heavy ceramic mugs, and the notary's forgotten pen crashing to the hardwood floor in a shower of glass and metal. Daniela shrieked, covering her head and backing into the corner. Gerald stepped in front of Helen, bracing for a physical fight. But Curtis didn't lunge at us. He spun around, his expensive leather shoes slipping momentarily in the spilled coffee, and sprinted out of the kitchen. He didn't head for the front door to escape. He bolted down the hallway and scrambled up the grand mahogany staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time. He's going for the safe, Daniela cried out, her voice raw with terror. Dad, the rest of Mom's things are up there. A spike of pure terror drove straight through my heart. Evelyn's wedding dress, her handwritten journals, the photo albums of Daniela's childhood that hadn't been digitized. The irreplaceable artifacts of the life we had built together were all stored in the massive walk-in closet of the primary suite. I didn't wait. I sprinted out of the kitchen, ignoring the screaming pain in my 68-year-old knees, and tore up the stairs after him. I reached the second-floor landing just in time to hear the heavy, solid-core oak door of the primary suite slam shut. A second later, the sharp, metallic clack of the heavy-duty deadbolt echoed through the hallway. I hit the door shoulder first, but it felt like slamming into a brick wall. Because it was. I had designed those doors myself. They were meant to provide absolute acoustic isolation and security, reinforced with steel hinges and a heavy timber core. Curtis! I roared, pounding my fists against the polished wood. Open this door! Open it right now! Back off! Curtis's voice came muffled through the heavy wood, frantic and completely unhinged. Back the hell off, Walter. Gerald and Helen rushed up the stairs behind me, breathing heavily. Daniela was right behind them, trembling like a leaf. Mr. Fowler, you are escalating a financial crime into a hostage situation. Gerald shouted through the door, his lawyerly composure finally cracking. The police are already en route. If you damage this property, you will face additional felony charges. I don't care, Curtis screamed. I could hear the sound of heavy furniture being dragged across the hardwood floor on the other side. He was barricading the door with the solid oak dresser. "I'm already going to prison. My life is over. But if I can't have this house, neither can you." My heart hammered against my ribs. I pressed my ear to the wood. I could hear him moving frantically around the room. I heard the distinct sound of the walk-in closet door swinging open. "I've got a lighter, Walter," Curtis yelled, his voice echoing off the walls of the massive closet. "I've got a lighter, and I'm standing right next to Evelyn's vintage silk wedding dress. You know how fast 50-year-old silk and tulle goes up in flames? It'll catch the cedar paneling in seconds. This whole house will be ash before the fire department even crosses the county line." "No," Daniela shrieked, throwing herself against the door, sobbing hysterically. "Curtis, please, it's my mother's dress. Please, don't do this. I'll forgive the debt. I'll tell the police it was a misunderstanding. Just don't burn her things." "Wire the money, Walter," Curtis demanded, his voice cracking with manic desperation. "Call your bank right now. Transfer $1.6 million to an offshore account of my choosing, or, I swear to God, I will burn your dead wife's memory to the ground." He was completely out of his mind. He was experiencing a total psychological collapse. He thought he had found the ultimate leverage point, my emotional attachment to Evelyn's memory. He thought he could extort me by holding my heart hostage behind a barricaded, impenetrable door. But Curtis made one massive, fatal miscalculation. He forgot who drew the blueprints. "Gerald," I said softly, stepping back from the door. My voice was no longer shaking. The panic was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating precision of a master architect. "Take Daniela downstairs. Go out to the front lawn and wait for the police. Do not let her come back up here." "Walter, what are you going to do?" Gerald asked, his eyes wide. "He's going to torch the house." "A house is just a box," I whispered, staring at the oak door. "But a home is a living organism, and I know exactly how to make this one bite back." I didn't wait for them to argue. I turned and sprinted down the opposite end of the hallway, heading toward the discreet, paneled door that hid the second-floor utility access shaft. 20 years ago, when I designed this house, I was obsessed with protecting my family. We lived in a heavily forested area, prone to devastating wildfires. When I drafted the plans for the primary suite and its massive archive closet, I didn't trust standard water sprinklers. Water destroys journals and antique silk just as effectively as fire does. So, I installed a secondary, isolated fire suppression system, strictly for the primary suite. It wasn't connected to the main house alarms, and it didn't use water. It used a high-pressure, commercial-grade halocarbon clean agent, a chemical gas designed to instantly aggressively displace oxygen to suffocate a fire without leaving a single drop of residue on valuable artifacts. It is also highly concentrated, freezing cold, and if a human being is trapped in the room when it deploys, they have roughly 60 seconds before the lack of oxygen renders them completely unconscious. I ripped open the utility panel. Inside was a chaotic mess of wiring, HVAC ducts, and plumbing lines. But right in the center, housed in a red metal box with a breakaway glass cover, was the manual override switch for the primary suite's halocarbon system. I grabbed a heavy metal wrench from the bottom shelf. I didn't know it yet, but flipping that switch was going to trigger a chain of events far more dangerous than anything Curtis had planned. Because as I smashed the glass and pulled the heavy red lever down, the house shuddered. A massive, deafening hiss of pressurized gas echoed from the walls, immediately followed by the sound of Curtis screaming in absolute terror as the freezing chemical fog flooded the master bedroom. I dropped the wrench, sprinted back down the hall to the barricaded door, and listened to my son-in-law choking on the synthetic air. I had exactly 1 minute to breach a door I had specifically designed to be unbreakable, or the man who ruined my daughter's life was going to die in my bedroom. The hissing of the high-pressure gas sounded like a jet engine inside the confined space of the primary suite. Through the thick oak door, I could hear Curtis coughing a wet, violent sound that rapidly dissolved into confused, frantic wheezing. Halocarbon is a miracle of modern fire suppression, because it drops the oxygen level in a room below the % threshold required for combustion in a matter of seconds. But human lungs need roughly 95% to stay conscious. I had 45 seconds left. I pressed my hands against the polished wood of the door. It was impenetrable. I had explicitly designed it to withstand a battering ram, reinforced with steel core rods and heavy-duty ball-bearing hinges. But architecture is just the illusion of absolute strength. Every structure, no matter how fortified, relies on the materials connecting it to the foundation. The door was steel and oak. The wall framing it, however, was standard half-inch drywall over pine studs. I didn't try to break the door. I raised the heavy metal wrench I had brought from the utility panel and swung it with every ounce of strength my 68-year-old shoulders possessed, driving it directly into the painted drywall, 6 inches to the left of the brass deadbolt. The drywall cracked. I swung again, adrenaline completely masking the agonizing flare of arthritis in my joints. Smash! The hammer end of the wrench punched a jagged hole through the plaster. I didn't stop. I used the handle to violently pry the hole wider, ripping away chunks of gypsum and pink fiberglass insulation. Inside the room, Curtis had stopped coughing. There was a dull thud against the floorboards. He had collapsed. I shoved my bare arm into the jagged hole in the wall, the broken edges of the drywall slicing into my forearm. I ignored the warm slide of blood soaking into my shirt sleeve. I blindly reached around the pine framing stud, feeling for the interior knob of the deadbolt. My fingertips brushed the cold brass. I twisted it sharply to the left. The lock clicked open. I pulled my bleeding arm out, grabbed the door handle, and threw my entire body weight against the heavy oak. The dresser Curtis had shoved against the inside scraped agonizingly across the hardwood floor, moving just 6 inches just enough. I squeezed through the narrow gap into the primary suite. The room was freezing, the air thick with a rapidly dissipating, cloudy mist. It felt like walking into a meat freezer. I immediately held my breath. Curtis was lying face down on the Persian rug at the foot of the bed. His lips were tinged blue, his eyes rolled back in his head. Just 3 feet away from his outstretched hand lay Evelyn's vintage silk wedding dress, pulled haphazardly from its archival box, and a silver Zippo lighter unlit. He had passed out before he could strike the flint. I grabbed my son-in-law by the collar of his ruined espresso-stained suit jacket. He was dead weight, but fury is an incredible source of leverage. I dragged his limp body backward, his expensive leather shoes sliding uselessly across the rug, pulling him through the narrow gap in the doorframe and out into the hallway. The moment we crossed the threshold, I gasped for the oxygen-rich air of the corridor, collapsing to my knees. My chest heaved. Below me, the wail of approaching sirens began to bleed through the acoustic glass of the house's exterior windows. Gerald had made the call. I reached up and slammed the heavy oak door shut, sealing the halocarbon inside. Curtis gasped. His chest hitched violently, and he rolled onto his side, coughing up a string of saliva, his eyes fluttering open as the oxygen flooded back into his brain. He looked up at me, disoriented, terrified, and completely pathetic. The great Silicon Valley visionary, reduced to a shivering, wheezing mess on my hallway floor. Within 90 seconds, the El Dorado County Sheriff's deputies swarmed the staircase, weapons drawn, followed closely by paramedics. They cleared the hallway, dragging Curtis down the stairs while applying a portable oxygen mask to his face. I followed slowly, wrapping a hand towel around my bleeding arm. When I reached the ground floor, the chaotic scene in the foyer looked like a Renaissance painting of absolute ruin. Daniela was wrapped in a shock blanket on the living room sofa, staring blankly at the wall. Gerald and Helen were calmly speaking to a pair of deputies. And then there was Curtis. The paramedics had removed his oxygen mask. The moment he realized he was surrounded by law enforcement, his survival instincts kicked back in. He was a cornered rat, and rats always bite the hand closest to them. "Arrest her," Curtis screamed, pointing a shaking manicured finger directly at Daniela. "She stole the jewelry. I have proof. She pawned it in Reno. And him." He wildly gestured toward me. "He locked me in a room and pumped poison gas through the vents. It's attempted murder. I want to press charges." The deputies exchanged tired, skeptical glances. "Actually, Mr. Fowler," a new voice cut through the shouting. A woman in a sharp navy windbreaker stepped through the open front door. Emblazoned across the back of her jacket in stark yellow letters was the acronym FBI. She walked into the foyer, flanked by 2 local detectives, holding a tablet. Helen Clark stepped forward, a deeply satisfied, predatory smile on her face. "I told you I ran the pawnshop footage 3 days ago, Curtis," Helen said smoothly. "What I didn't tell you is what I did with it." The final twist in Curtis's miserable saga hadn't been orchestrated by me. It had been executed by the woman he had underestimated the most. "When we identified Jessica Vance in the security footage," Helen explained, turning to look at Daniela, "I didn't wait for today's confrontation. I visited Jessica at her apartment yesterday at Sao, Home A. I showed her the footage. I explained that she was looking at a minimum of 15 years in federal prison for interstate wire fraud and identity theft. I told her that you, Curtis, were planning to pin the entire thing on your wife, leaving Jessica to take the fall as the unauthorized accomplice. Curtis's jaw slacked. The remaining color drained from his face. No, Jess wouldn't. Jess absolutely would, the FBI agent interrupted dryly. Ms. Vance retained counsel immediately. She signed a proffer agreement with the United States Attorney's Office last night. In exchange for immunity on the pawnshop charges, she handed over your secondary, encrypted laptop. The agent tapped the screen of her tablet. We have the IP logs of you digitally forging your wife's signatures for the credit cards. We have the emails between you and Marcus Gray, detailing your intent to defraud Mr. Stanley of this property to launder the loan money. You aren't just going away for grand larceny, Curtis. You are being federally indicted for conspiracy, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you finally use it. I watched the exact moment Curtis Fowler's soul left his body. There was no more screaming. There were no more threats. The arrogant, untouchable venture capitalist simply ceased to exist. 2 deputies hauled him to his feet, wrenched his arms behind his back, and secured the steel handcuffs around his wrists. The metallic click-click was the most beautiful sound I had heard in years. They marched him out the front door. He didn't look back. He didn't look at me, and he didn't look at the wife he had systematically destroyed. He just stared at the floorboards, walking into the absolute oblivion he had built for himself. The house slowly cleared out. The police took my statement regarding the fire suppression system, which they quickly ruled as justifiable self-defense against an active arson threat. Gerald promised to handle all the ongoing legal paperwork. Eventually, it was just me and Daniela. She was sitting on the bumper of a dispatched ambulance in the driveway, the flashing red lights painting her pale face in rhythmic bursts. She had packed 2 suitcases, the clothes she had brought with her a year ago. Nothing bought with the fraudulent credit cards, nothing of Curtis's, just her. I walked out into the freezing afternoon air and stood beside her. We looked out over the massive front lawn, toward the spot where my wife's roses used to bloom, now covered in ugly, black asphalt. I don't have anywhere to go, Dad, Daniela whispered, her voice completely hollow, stripped of all the corporate entitlement she had worn for the past year. My apartment is gone. My credit is ruined. I'm bankrupt. I have absolutely nothing. I looked down at her. Part of me, the dad who used to fix her broken toys with superglue, wanted to tell her to carry her bags upstairs. To tell her she could stay in her childhood room forever, and I would pay the lawyers to make the debt disappear. But if architecture teaches you anything, it's that building on top of a rotten foundation guarantees a collapse. She needed to hit bedrock before she could rebuild. Your friend Rachel still lives in Sacramento, doesn't she? I asked quietly. Daniela looked up at me, tears spilling over her eyelashes. Yes, but we haven't spoken in months. Curtis told me she was toxic. Maybe it's time to rebuild some of the bridges you let him burn, I said. She reached out and gently touched the bandage the paramedics had wrapped around my forearm. She looked at the blood seeping through the white gauze, a physical testament to what I had endured to save a man who didn't deserve it, just to save her mother's memory. I'm so sorry, Daddy, she sobbed, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. I chose greed. I chose a liar over you. I let him convince me that you were a burden. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve it. I'll always love you, Danny, I said, my voice steady, though my heart was breaking. But trust, respect, a relationship, those have to be earned back. You have a lot of hard work ahead of you. Therapy, bankruptcy court, finding a job. Until you face that reality and prove you've changed, we don't have much to talk about. I didn't hug her. I just turned and walked back up the steps of my porch. I watched her load her 2 suitcases into the trunk of her car. I watched her pull out of the driveway, her taillights disappearing down Lakeshore Boulevard, leaving me completely, utterly alone. But for the first time in a year, the silence in the house didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like room to breathe. The following months passed in a strange, healing sort of calm. Gerald handled the divorce proceedings and the legal fallout. Curtis was denied bail, sitting in a federal holding facility, awaiting a trial he couldn't possibly win. The hard money lender, Marcus Gray, was swept up in the FBI's racketeering sting. Daniela filed for bankruptcy and moved into a tiny studio apartment in Sacramento, taking a job as a junior graphic designer to slowly pay off the debts she could. I reclaimed my space. I moved my vintage Leica cameras back to their proper shelf. I rehung my abstract oil paintings, and in early autumn, I made a decision about the trust. I contacted the Lake Tahoe Community Center and proposed a monthly seminar series on the principles of architectural design. Free sessions open to students and recent graduates. The first session drew 12 hungry young minds. We sat in my restored living room, looking out over the lake, and talked about load-bearing walls, the poetry of functional space, and how to build structures that complement their environment rather than dominating it. I officially set up the Stanley Educational Architecture Fund with an initial $50,000, ensuring my legacy would go to people who actually respected the craft. The letter from Daniela arrived in mid-September. It was handwritten, 3 pages. No excuses, no begging for money, just a raw acknowledgement of her failures and the hard work she was doing to rebuild her soul. I read it 3 times. I put it in a drawer. I didn't reply. Not yet. Some bridges take years to reconstruct, and I was in no rush. On a crisp, freezing November morning, I walked out onto my back deck with my camera. The frost was heavy on the lawn. At the far edge of the property line, the wooden shed still stood. I hadn't torn it down. I hadn't cleaned it out. I left the military cot and the bare bulb exactly as they were. It was a monument. A reminder that sometimes you have to remember exactly how low you've been to appreciate the view from the top. I raised the camera to my eye. Through the viewfinder, the sun was just beginning to crest over the crystal-clear waters of Lake Tahoe. The light fractured perfectly across the surface. Everything was clean, precise, and exactly as it should be. Justice, I've learned, has an incredible architecture of its own. You just have to be patient enough and smart enough to see the design completed. And standing there on my deck, breathing in the freezing air as a free man in his own home, I finally understood what a perfect foundation felt like.